So let me take you then through the headlines that Rob has just outlined. Next slide, please. So this work is based partly on the work that we've done at the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. We have released 2 reports already on climate change, one on energy policies related to climate change, the bank's work related to energy policies, and more recently our review of activities related to project-level activities on climate mitigation. And stay tuned around the middle of next year for our report on the bank group's work related to adaptation. Next, please. We've also drawn on some work by our colleagues in the ECG, including the monumental OPS4, the review of the fourth replenishment of the GEF, the ADB's reports, and the summary note from the ECG. Next, please. So let's go to the first headline, which I think is really the most important, which is the fantastic cost effectiveness of energy efficiency projects, both in raw local economic terms and in greenhouse gas impacts. So our colleagues at the GEF Evaluation Office reviewed the GEF's work on clean energy. And they found that they measure kind of the catalytic impact of GEF funding. How many tons of greenhouse gas emissions result from GEF grant? They found that $1 of GEF support in the sample they looked at catalyzed about 2.2 tons of CO2 reduction in energy efficiency projects, and about 0.4 on average from renewable energy projects. We've also found across the group that there are energy efficiency projects that actually offer paybacks in months or even weeks. These include efficient lighting projects, which I'll talk about in a moment, and projects that end the wasteful flaring of natural gas. So next slide. So let me take you through this, and this one I'll require some careful coordination on the technical support, because what we're going to do is first we're going to look at this graph, and then we're going to in effect zoom out. So what we did is we looked at a bunch of different renewable energy and energy efficiency projects, some clean energy projects at the World Bank and the IFC, and we graphed them according to 2 criteria. On the vertical axis, it's the economic return. You can think of this as the dollars in energy saving per dollar of investment. And on the horizontal axis, we've got what you could call the carbon return, the kilograms of carbon savings you get, CO2 savings you get for each dollar you put into investment. And you can see an interesting scatter here. The wind and hydro plants are the light blue triangles and the dark blue rectangles, respectively. They have rather modest economic returns. The wind power is typically around 7%, maybe a little bit more in some cases. Hydropower can range from very low to up to about 18%. And there's a wide variety of carbon savings, depending really upon the milieu they find themselves on. Off there on the left-hand side, you see one important category of energy efficiency projects, which are transmission and distribution efficiency projects. And these have returns of 20 to 40% in economic terms. That's the savings that the country itself will realize in hard cash, and they provide some carbon returns as well. But now, what I'd like you to do is to imagine that we're going to zoom backwards. We're going to pull the camera back and expose a larger range of returns. So next slide, please. This is just circling. And again, I'll have to keep asking you to keep click. And again. And again. I wish I had a clicker. Just keep clicking. So now here you see a couple of green projects appearing. These are energy efficiency projects. Now we're going to pull back. Next slide. Now we've revealed a wider range of returns, and suddenly we start to see projects that have economic returns at the level of 100% to 120%. These include industrial energy efficiency projects and CFLs, that's efficient lighting, where you swap out incandescent bulbs and replace them with compact fluorescent lighting. Let's draw back again, another slide. And I think there's one more. So, I think we're missing some dots. So you can see that these energy efficiency projects are offering economic returns that exceed just about everything else we do in the development business, with the possible exception maybe of some nutrition projects. So in economic terms, they dwarf everything else that's being done, and they offer greenhouse gas benefits as well. Thank you. Next slide. Oh, sorry. This is the final reveal of some projects that have 600% and 700% returns. Now let me add a word of caution here, because one of the points that I'll return to at the end is that our measurement of these returns is nowhere near as solid as we would like. A lot of these are based on ex-ante estimates. We'll return to the point there's not enough monitoring going on to really assure us of these things. But the magnitudes are so great that even if we're off by a large factor, these are attractive projects. Next, please. Second point. This, I think, is probably familiar to everyone here, but it's worth stressing how fossil fuel subsidies not only are fiscally burdensome, not only are regressive and greenhouse gas promoting, but they also get in the way of implementing these energy efficiency projects. So there's a report to the G20 by the World Bank and some other agencies, IEA, estimated there's $300 to $600 billion a year in these subsidies. We found in a review of public expenditure reviews that often for many countries more money is being spent on energy subsidies than is being spent by the public authorities on health. Just about everyone who's tried to track who is receiving these subsidies finds that they go disproportionately to wealthy groups. It's not surprising because it's the wealthy folks who have the cars and the air conditioners that consume energy that's subsidized. One estimate with a global model, global computable general equilibrium model, found that if these subsidies were removed, not only would the world save that $500 billion a year, but it would immediately reduce CO2 emissions by about 7%. Our own analysis found that for those countries that heavily subsidize diesel fuel, that's an indicator, proxy for fuel subsidies, their energy intensity is about twice as high as comparable countries that have the same level of income and the same needs for heating. So these subsidies are truly driving inefficiency, and it's immediately obvious that subsidies directly reduce the returns to investment in energy efficiency, and so tremendously discourage these kinds of investments. Next, please. Well, what can we do about subsidies? Obviously, there are many strong political forces that keep subsidies in place. There are people who benefit from these. And I have to say that in reviewing the experience of the banks, we don't have a lot of success stories. There are some success stories related to the accession of some of the Eastern European countries to the EU, where subsidies were removed because that was a very large carrot that was dangled. The banks helped with that. One interesting experience that hasn't been evaluated is the Indonesian experience, where they were spending about 8% of GDP on kerosene and fuel subsidies. They decided to wean the population off these subsidies by providing an unconditional cash transfer to poor people. They enlisted the Bureau of Statistics to identify rapidly which villages and which people were poor. This is not very rigorous evidence, but this woman is very happy to be receiving her unconditional cash transfer. The government did reduce kerosene subsidies, but it's hard to make this sustainable. I noted in the paper that Indonesia is again facing strong pressures to keep those subsidies going. Next, please. Turning to a different topic, one of the areas in which all the MDBs, well, at least the EBRD, the World Bank, IFC, and I believe the ADB have been very active, is in energy efficiency finance. Now, there was a story that went behind the invention of this approach to energy efficiency finance that began about 10 years ago. Could I have a click, please? There was a diagnosis, and the diagnosis is you've got a lot of companies in Eastern Europe and China, other places where there's a legacy of very inefficient equipment coming out of legacy of energy subsidies. So the story is that the industrial firms, for instance, don't understand that there are benefits to be had. They can save a lot of money by investing in new equipment. And on the other hand, there's a story that the banks just couldn't get their heads around the idea that this would be a bankable project, that you could invest money in efficient equipment and the fuel savings would enable the borrower to make that, to repay the loan. Next, please. So, based on this diagnosis, there were prescriptions that were widely carried out. First, energy audits and technical assistance for the industrial firms to help them understand what are their opportunities for energy efficiency. Second, technical assistance to the banks so they could understand how to appraise these loans. And third, a temporary subsidized loan guarantee. The idea was that the banks are too nervous that they wouldn't want to make these loans. Give them a subsidized guarantee, they'll try it, they'll realize, oh, it's not as risky as we thought, we're making money on this, and then the guarantee could be removed, and you would have market transformation, because the market would take off after that. So here's what we found when we compared experience. Next please. And again. The diagnosis was not entirely correct. It turns out that there were, at least some of these formulations were not correct. They thought that banks finance projects, but really, in most of these places, the banks finance companies. They don't finance projects. The banks understand perfectly well that you can save money, that the companies can save money by investing, for instance, in cogeneration, like this picture. What the banks worry about is that the companies aren't going to pay them back. This is what they're most concerned about. And for that reason, in these countries that have poorly developed credit markets, they typically have extremely high, onerous requirements for collateral. You have to post huge amounts of collateral in order to borrow money. And this freezes many small and medium enterprises out of the market. So what we found is that when these subsidized guarantees were offered, it did indeed give the banks the ability to make those loans. And those loans had very high economic rates of return, and they were good for the companies, they were good for the environment, they more than justified on a global basis these subsidies. But they weren't transformative. In other words, when you remove the subsidized loan, the banks went back to worrying, well, gee, these guys don't have any collateral, can I really loan to them? Next slide. However, and also we found that in some cases these guarantees were aimed at large companies, and large companies, for instance, those in China, typically have access to capital. They're in a different category from the small companies. However, we did find both at the bank, the IFC, and I believe the EBRD, that the technical assistance was helpful to the banks. The banks were able to use these tools and go to their creditworthy customers and say, hey, you've got some opportunities in retrofitting that you might want to borrow for. Next. Now we come to the category of demonstration and pilot projects. And these are, in many ways, some of the highest leverage ways that public institutions can spend their money. Here again, the idea is that companies may be, they're not familiar with some new technology. They think it costs too much, they're worried that it's risky. The technology itself may need some debugging to be applicable to the local conditions. There may be some technical issues, there may be some regulatory issues. So what we found is that these kinds of projects can indeed really catalyze widespread diffusion of technology. But there's what might seem like an obvious catch, which is that for a demonstration project to be successful, it has to think really hard about what it's demonstrating, who it's demonstrating to, and why. It's not enough simply to build a machine in your backyard and think that the world's going to discover it. You have to be proactive in getting the message out and putting it into the industry. So that's one lesson. Another lesson is that for these reasons, the GEF has played a disproportionate role in this kind of activity. Because these kinds of projects are ex-ante risky, the use of grant money to defray the risk of the host country, and the availability of money to pay for the preparation of these projects, which are typically much more expensive than regular projects. They're innovative, has been important. So a couple of quick examples. There was a UNDP project, the Township and Village Enterprise Project in China. China has been a great user of demonstration projects, by the way. So both my examples are from there. This project was explicitly designed with some technologies that were going to be demonstrated and provisions for replicating it in a bunch of replication sites. And the impacts were scaled up tenfold or 20-fold from the initial demonstration. The picture here relates to another project, the Energy Conservation Project, which introduced the idea of ESCOs to China. You may be familiar with ESCOs, or energy service companies that provide both financing and technical advice to their borrowers. So they come in and they're supposed to give a bundled solution. Here's the equipment you need, and we'll finance it, and you just have to pay back the loan. This was a completely unfamiliar concept in China. So the demonstration project set up 3 demonstration companies and compelled them to keep their doors open and demonstrate how they work to others. And so now there are hundreds and hundreds of these companies that have learned from that initial demonstration. Next, please. Briefly, one thing that we find, it's hard to document rigorously, but it's a consistent undertone, is that there are biases against energy efficiency. And these are understandable from an institutional viewpoint. If you compare an energy efficiency project to a project that sets up generation, generation is much easier. It's basically an engineering problem. You can disperse a lot of cash quickly, and for many public institutions, they're judged by how much money they're putting out to clean energy. Everybody's always asking, how much money are you spending on clean energy? This is a way to get a lot of money out the door, and it doesn't cost as much to prepare them. In contrast, the energy efficiency projects can actually offer higher returns, but they're very complex to prepare. They may not be very large in volume, and there are no ribbons to cut. It's not always as appealing to everybody involved. But I think this tide is changing. Here's a picture from Bangladesh, which recently decided that rather than build a new fossil fuel power plant, they were going to set the world record in the number of compact fluorescent lights that were distributed in a day. And that project is ongoing. Next. So just to wrap up, one of the things we find throughout is there's a huge need for monitoring and evaluation of this. A lot of these things are pioneering efforts. They involve energy efficiency. Really involves complicated behavioral issues. What makes households and companies decide to invest? What do they understand? How do they view risk? What's going on? So to know what works and what doesn't work and why, and to know it rapidly, we need to invest a lot more in real-time monitoring, in setting up comparison groups so we really know what the causal impact of these interventions are, and in folding in greenhouse gas monitoring, which is now done quite inconsistently. And finally, in doing long-term sustainability analysis, so we know that these projects keep working over time, whether they have the diffusion effects we hope for. And this kind of information could help raise the profile of energy efficiency projects and fight the bias that I've talked about. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ken.